use today, but at least one of them, I think, had a conflict with the cluster API. And the other one, I don't know if Brendan got that scheduled. The cloud provider extraction, the one it was. So I put them on the backlog. We should try to get them scheduled for an upcoming meeting.
So I got a little bit of information from Brendan on the cloud provider thing. I think that he's concerned about it running as a pod or service on the cluster. And basically, I think that he was hoping to do it in a different way, where there are binaries on each node and the kubelet shells out to them. So I think that that was the concern in a nutshell.
Okay.
Because of instance metadata. Because the nodes.
I should look at that. I'm not a fan of shelling out, but I can follow up on that. The one confusing thing about the cloud provider, the current cloud provider interface, is it includes both node local functionality and cluster level functionality without a clear distinction between the two.
It's so confusing. I tried to trace sort of what the AWS cloud provider was doing at different nodes, and it's like the interface makes it hard to figure out who's doing what.
Yeah. So the interface is just, the current interface is just wrong.
And I think the interface also assumes that everything is being provided by one provider. And as you look to go things like on-prem, you may have your load balancing stuff be one type of thing, and your block device stuff be a different type of thing.
Or even that all nodes are in the same provider as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely something that we're going to have to look at some point. But so today was an office hour. Those were the two potential things that I thought may have been brought here, but I don't expect them to be brought here today. Aaron is taking a well-deserved break, I believe, but he did a bunch of work on pushing the sub-projects identification forward, starting mostly with the independent repos, the freestanding repos, and then just doing the workloads API is kind of an example of some things that are in the Kubernetes repo. So we need to flesh out the rest of the sub-projects in the Kubernetes repo, which is most of the projects. I added a few like kubedns and things like that, but I think we're ready. I could go through and probably do it, but I think it would be better to ask the SIGs to self-identify like what sub-projects they think they have, and to check the work that Aaron and I did on the existing list.
So do we have a carrot or a stick to get the SIGs to actually do that?
I'm not sure that we need one yet.
You were such an optimist, Brian.
Yeah, you would think after 4 years I would have learned, but
I'm just thinking like, and I think we see this with the KEP stuff, right? It's like if it's all processed with no gain, it's like people understand, it's like eating your vegetables, but like unless there's some sort of clear benefit out of it, I think it's going to be a lot trickier to do this stuff.
Just to jump on Joe's thing here real quick here, it's actually, I think, more that the people who would go put this stuff in are probably overloaded with so much to do that this is just going to be a low priority on their list. So is there a carrot to like raise the priority to get them to actually look at this or get engaged?
Yeah.
The biggest carrot.
The
biggest carrot I see is like getting engagement and awareness, right? Because getting engagement is something that I'm focusing a lot on lately, a lot more than I have in the past, because I think it's more important than actually just doing the work yourself, but getting a cohesive group of people to make it sustainable over time, right? We're in this stage now where kind of like we're past the formation of the star, and it's in the main sequence, right? In order for it to not implode on us, we need to make sure that we're have a sustainable group that can like, come and go over time. That's important, but I don't know how you turn that into a carrot, right? Like that's for people who are currently the SIG leads, if you want to call them that, they're doing too many things, right?
So, I mean, so one like small thing we could do here is update the generation scripts in the community repo such that on the sort of SIG README page, it lists out, and I don't know if Aaron already did that, it lists out all the repos that are associated with that SIG. And so that's just, I mean, it's some simple discovery, but, I think people can be like, okay, yeah, that page then starts to become the like canonical sort of like what's happening in this SIG, and we can grow that over time. It's small, but like that's at least a small carrot, right?
In terms of a stick, we can threaten to make stuff up. On the, people will jump in and correct things that they think are wrong. So
yeah.
So what is the action that you want people to take? I'm a little lost.
So we're trying to identify what the subprojects are that are under each SIG and where the code for those subprojects live. And the way we're identifying where the code lives is by identifying the owner's files for those subprojects.
So, okay, so the line of thinking here, Justin, goes is that like if we can actually have SIGs be more sort of self-contained and we have clearer lines of delineation for what's happening in what SIG, then those SIGs can actually be healthier, more functional over time. But we really need to start having things be owned by the project as a whole, which is now a tragedy of the commons, to actually being identifying sort of what is the small group of people or smaller group of people that is responsible for any particular piece of code. And so it's one of those things where when we get there, I'm confident that we're actually going to end up in a better, more functional situation, but all the little steps along the way are a little bit harder to justify.
I mean, right now, I think there's a massive carrot, which is a little different, but which is the idea that SIGs can now have their own projects in a SIG repo, right? So I think that will be something which, well, I don't think it's confirmed yet, but like when that is confirmed in an hour or two, right, then we will, like tomorrow's SIG AWS meeting, we're going to talk about like who wants to have a project under SIG AWS and what does it look like, right? And I think there will be a bunch of those. And so I think that's a step towards it. It's not pulling stuff out yet, but it is establishing that behavior.
And I think the assumption is that all those projects then would be listed in this thing. But what about sort of existing, we don't even like have a definition of what exactly.
Well, so there's a carrot for you. Nobody can get a new repo unless they identify their existing code.
Oh, there you go. Or at least, make a pass through the spreadsheet and mark the stuff that you think.
I think that seems totally fair.
Yeah, no, that seems, because that's not that hard, but it's like, it's going to take somebody 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, for a single SIG, that seems about right. Yeah, I like that.
Sold.
So Jace was asking for, I guess we're doing a check-in at the community meeting, so I think this is the topic.
Brian, are you going to be there?
Yeah, I can be there today.
Do you mind giving the update then?
Yep, I can do that.
Thanks.
So Brian, Joe, I had a related question. Do we identify the list of people who are like core members of a SIG? Do we do that, or do we want to do that? Did we rule that out?
So that's a great question. It's something that the steering committee has been taking up, essentially sort of how do we start getting some more, explicit governance over SIGs. I don't want to say formal, but at least explicit and spelled out. There's a PR in the community repo. I believe it's in the community, or is it in the steering committee repo? I forget which one.
It's in the steering repo. I have it open so I can post a link.
That essentially has a template for SIG charters, and part of that is determining membership. The current proposal is that the source of record for membership of a SIG would be a mailing list. Now, different SIGs can choose different things, but that would sort of be the default choice there. I'm not happy with that, but I don't know what the alternatives are. I think the other thing is to look at sort of the transitive closure of all the people mentioned in owners files across all the projects and subprojects of a SIG might also be considered members, but we don't have the tooling to sort of synchronize those things. So
there are also issues with that, like people who don't check in artifacts but are important participants.
Right. So you'd have to have some way to extend that to actually be people who are, put them in some sort of, owner's file, maybe in the community repo for the page for that SIG or something like that, right? So that they get
right. The reason for asking that is when you vote somebody into becoming a member of a particular SIG, then you can tell them that, look, this is what we expect from you, and you have to keep track of issues. You should help triage stuff. You should help review. So they are buying into the system, saying, okay, this is what is expected.
Yeah. So one thing we talked about I think it was at the Leadership Summit, was creating more specific roles for SIGs, more like the release team, where there are these roles for people who do issue triage and things like that. It's like the build cop rotation, but chopped up by SIG and covering more duties. So that would be a way that we could actually, put those roles into the owner's files and specify those people. So I'm a fan of that idea. My original motivation for that idea is I saw success within the release team of getting people to sign up by saying there were a couple of aspects to it. One is the responsibilities, the scope, and the time commitment was a lot more clear for people than just like, oh, there's this pile of GitHub issues and it's not clear which ones are important or, how actionable they are and stuff like that. Please go help us with that. Like that's not, people didn't even know how to get started on that. But also, it's easy for them to explain to their manager, it's easy for them to get some amount of credit or visibility. It made it clear to everyone on the project, like, look, the project cannot function unless this role is filled. So I think it had a lot of benefits, providing a lot of clarity. So I'm a fan of moving in that direction, identifying more clear roles.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I wonder if there's some value, and don't underestimate the value of like formal recognition. Just elevating people out of the, I attend the weekly SIG meeting to I'm, responsible for role X. Do we want to kind of put a canonical set of roles together that we don't have to force on any SIGs, but like these are kind of known 4 or 5 roles, whatever, that we've seen work in a few good SIGs, and maybe you want to pick up these roles and names just so that otherwise we just end up with this plethora of unintelligible terms for these roles.
Go for it.
And maybe do it as examples, because a number of SIGs may already have some of this going. But I like the idea of documenting this in examples, because when people get recognition, they tend to jump in and be excited about that kind of stuff, and it kind of gets to that human carrot. They're recognized in there, and so I like that. When it comes to you're thinking the mailing list is a way to describe SIG membership?
No.
Okay.
We should not do that. We should definitely not do that.
Well, no, this is what the proposal says right now, Brian.
Yeah, I know, but I haven't had time to read the full proposal. So the proposal has a bunch of issues. That's one of them, but it also is not reconciled with the sub-project and owner's effort at all. Like it uses different terms and has different roles and stuff like that.
But okay, so if not,
review that.
But is there a better way to say who's a member of a SIG? And it's hard, because if you say you've got to get them listed in a file, then that puts expectations. A lot of our commits that come to like Kubernetes are from a core group of people, and then there's just really long tail. And so if to become a member, you've got to get into a file and get more involvement. That raises the barrier to entry to be part of it. And like a lot of the people who come to some of these SIGs who are just starting, I mean, they're just lurkers as they come in. And are they a member? Are we now saying they're not a member even if they come but they lurk? That kind of gets into an odd line there. And we want to be careful, because right now we're talking about people being overloaded, doing too much. Now we're talking about ways of raising the barrier to entry to involvement.
I don't think it raises the barrier to entry. I mean, that's why I don't want to use the email list as the canonical source of membership. Like I wouldn't want to exclude people from the mailing list from getting engaged, from going to meetings. But I mean, maybe member is not the right term.
I was going to say that I think maybe contributor and observer are closer to the truth. I mean, we don't have to use those exact words, but
yeah, contributor is better.
Matt, this goes back to what Tim was saying about expanding the pool of people who are doing, things more, and they can come and go out, kind of thing, right? So this goes to that portion, not trying to trim off the long tail or anything like that.
Yeah, and I get a lot into this because when we start talking about members, it invariably goes into how do you do elections, and now you've got an electorate set. And that's where a number of the conversations have come. And so, if somebody's involved in a lurker, are they not to be involved in elections? Do we got to wait for that to be contributors? And this gets to the SIG level because people have been, maybe not here, I can't remember all the locations, have talked about SIG level elections. And then how do you decide what to do with those kinds of things if we eventually go that route? And so member conversations can have an impact on that, or the language we use. Now, contributor is a little bit easier to look at because I can go to GitHub and I can see all the contributors. Well, I can see the top 100, but you can drill into who's a contributor on a project and see the number. Like Kubernetes has like 1,600 contributors to that repo. And you can actually trace that to people. And you can look at all the other repos underneath the Kubernetes org and say, here are the contributors to that.
Well, Matt, that's right. But then what happens is during a release cycle, for example, right? If there is a smaller group of people in a specific SIG that are reachable by the SIG, release team lead for things that need to be fixed or moved out or whatever, right? That is where it helps.
Oh yeah, totally. But there's the difference between are you a member of something and are you fulfilling a specific role, like on call for the SIG, and that's a vastly different thing. Like, am I a citizen of the country I'm in, or do I serve in the government? It's kind of two different things, but you're involved in it from one way or another. Okay, Joe. I'll be quiet now.
No, I think in terms of, there are going to be places where having some standing in a SIG is going to matter, right? When you're rotating SIG leadership, it's going to be up to the SIG to figure out how they rotate. But opening it up such that, anybody can object, is not having some sort of backstop around sort of like who has standing is necessary. When we were doing the steering committee bootstrap stuff, really, I think one of the hardest things that we wrestled with was who had standing to actually vote in that thing. And I don't want to put us in a position where we're ad hocing that stuff in the future. So I think a big part of what we're doing now is moving from sort of ad hoc processes to something that's written down. And I think there's also the question of, as we look towards future steering committee elections, how do we come up with the members of standing there? And is that sort of the transitive closure of all the members to some degree of what member means of all the SIGs? So yeah. All right. So Brian, you had a comment too.
Yeah, I just want to put the brakes on the discussion. We're like way off topic for SIG architecture at this point. And it's a good discussion, but it's not really within scope of SIG architecture. Quentin did drop a link into the backlog for his labels as a first-class resource proposal. Do you just want to say a few words about that, Quentin?
I don't want to waste everyone's time because the document's not done yet, but basically it's an attempt to try and address a couple of issues we've run across in various different guises related to kind of referring to groups of objects. And it came up in multi-tenancy, and it came up in federation. And since throwing that doc out there, a ton of people have come to me and said, oh, that's, we've run into exactly these problems before. So it seems to be getting some traction. I haven't had time to finish it off this week yet, but I just wanted to make everyone aware of it and aware that it doesn't really fit terribly well into any of the existing SIGs other than this one. So we could shoehorn it into probably SIG Off or something, or we could take it on in the SIG. I don't know what your preferences are.
It probably should be this SIG, I would guess. I mean, I glanced at it. The link was dropped in here. It seems like a pretty major change to the system, potentially. Is that fair?
Yeah, the thinking is that it could be done as like a CRD initially, just to toy around with the idea, and it doesn't have to be like baked into core or anything like that. And if we think that it serves a useful purpose, we could consider promoting it into core at some point in the future.
So Quentin, for me, the trickiest thing here is, and I think, man, you've added stuff to it since last I looked. I think for me, the restricting who can write what labels where is one thing. restricting visibility of those things becomes a heck of a lot harder, and that has to be baked in at a deeper level.
Not necessarily, actually. I don't think, well, implementation-wise, it's reasonably straightforward to have labels with RBAC rules saying you can see these and you can't see those, and attachments of labels to things where you can see this attachment or you can't.
So the problem, though, is that the RBAC rules are based on the actor, and most controllers use some sort of joint service account that doesn't represent the person who created the original object. And so this is our issues that have been talked about quite a bit in SIG Off. There's this proposal around validated annotations that is facing similar problems that Mike Denise and some of the security folks at Google have been pushing also. Fundamentally, objects in Kubernetes are owned by the namespace. There is no owner field on an object. And so that there's no sort of propagation or reference to that owner. So if we did something like saying, hey, certain labels were only visible to a specific namespace, that starts getting more tractable, because most things operators understand the namespace that they're working in. They don't understand the user that they're working on behalf of.
But labels are only scoped to namespace. So that's, other than if the labels are on any namespace resource, they're only at scope within that.
And I think some of this comes down to nodes, right? And so the idea of like having a label on a node that gets stuck, I don't know. So I would think about it in terms of namespaces being the security boundary, because honestly, that's where we're at right now, versus trying to actually tie this back to users because of the confused deputy issues around controllers.
Yeah. So I saw your comment and I responded to it in the document, but maybe we can spend, if we have a minute. So a lot of it comes down to exactly this problem, I think, which is that, the word namespace in my mind implies that it's a partitioning of the names, so that you can have duplicate names in different namespaces. And it has come to take on a meaning of role. And essentially, if you're in this namespace, then you get a whole bunch of, permissions to do things. Is that a, and then we have these labels which are designed to divide things up in a different way. Are we comfortable that the concept of a namespace has come to mean in many respects a role? If something's in that namespace, it fulfills a role and has all the permissions associated with what is effectively a role.
That's the default service account is for the namespace is giving those permissions. Is that where that comes from?
No, it's sort of implied by all the controllers, I think. If a controller is dealing with something in a namespace, then it assumes that it has certain rights based on the RBAC rules associated with that namespace. Joe can clarify correctly.
So, just concretely, Brian, like if I create a replica set, if I have permissions to create a replica set, I have permissions to essentially create a pod with any permissions inside of a namespace.
Oh, because we don't transitively check the RBAC.
Right. So if there was, like, if we did something like, hey, we don't have this pattern now, but if we said, hey, when I specify a replica set, part of the metadata there is the principle that the controller should be using when actually creating the downstream objects, right? And then it impersonates that, and then it uses that identity to create the downstream objects. If we had that, then you could start perhaps tying this stuff up to users in a more concrete way. But then that would be up to the controllers to actually really do that impersonation and make that happen.
Do we want to do that instead of extending RBAC? Isn't it better just to do the transitive RBAC check?
Well, so what would transitive RBAC look like? Because I think the other thing is that we don't have validated.
Well, it would look like, so what it would look like is you would attach to the replica, set the extended permissions that it needs to create pods and things like that.
So right. So I think, yeah, you can check it. You can check it at the time that the replica set is created or mutated.
Right. And it's not great in the sense that, like, if you rip away the permissions, you don't rip away the permissions for the replica set, but like that's probably okay.
No, I think that's actually a feature. But I think the feature that we're looking at here is that when you create an object, part of creating an object is you can imbue it with some of your power for downstream things, and then controllers can take advantage of that.
Okay.
Well, I guess that's the question. Like, I actually would say we probably don't want to do that. That we would rather do the gate check up front, and then like not give your power effectively. You see what I'm saying?
No, but
Like,
Brian and Jace are both looking to talk.
So I don't think we need to design this now, but I just want to find out if everybody was happy with what we have today, and it doesn't sound like we are. So
I'm happy with it, to be honest. I'm fine with namespace being the security boundary.
I have a question, which is what problem is this proposal actually trying to solve? Because I haven't read the proposal.
I'd rather write all that down in the doc, and it is very light on that. But the basic problem is referring to objects, and it boils down to what we've just been discussing. So how do you determine whether an action is allowed based on the RBAC authorization of whoever's doing it, as opposed to which namespace some things that are related to it live in.
Okay.
So for what it's worth, I'm perfectly happy with namespace being the security boundary. I don't think it's worth the churn or the complexity to try and subdivide things more finely. And just historically, this is based on, lightly based on the Google model, where the thing that's most closely analogous to a namespace in Borg is in fact a principal and a role. And it's not perfect, but it actually is simple enough that it doesn't have any sort of super crazy failure modes.
Yeah, and namespaces have multiple functions. It's a scoping mechanism to avoid name collisions and label selector collisions and things like that. And I would like it usable for that. So, we need to make sure that users have ways of partitioning their resources into multiple namespaces. And I don't think we've done a great job at that. It's also a place to hang various sorts of policies and defaulting, like RBAC rules, but also other kinds of policies. And then thirdly, it's effectively this authorization domain because of the lack of transitive application of the checks, as we've been discussing. In some cases, that has been intentionally utilized as a feature, because RBAC is so limited right now. You can only do things based on like resource type and namespace and principal and things like that. So if you have different types of resources that you want different policies on, that's hard or impossible to express at the moment.
And for what?
Go ahead.
What was that?
So I was going to say, for what it's worth, the Azure API system more or less has namespaces and hangs RBAC and policy and all kinds of stuff off of them. And that lack of flexibility has actually become increasingly a problem. So we should consider extending it to be label-based effectively at some point.
Yeah, I think that mirrored what Clayton said as well. So I'll tell you what I'll do is I will get much more concrete in the doc. I'll try and enumerate, 20 important things that we would like to do and that we either cannot do with the current system or can do with some major compromises. And then once we have that on the table, we can decide whether change is necessary to accommodate those and similar types of things.
So for what it's worth, I think, the core of this discussion probably, would make the most progress in SIG Off. This is the type of stuff that like bakes your noodle and you just have to go deep into it to really understand all the implications. I think it's a feature in Kubernetes that objects are not owned by users. It creates that problem where, it avoids the problem where individual people own a thing and then that person leaves and rotates code. Or you have the magic laptop with the key on it or whatever, right? So I think that idea of group ownership, not just by default, but just like there is no individual ownership, makes a ton of sense. The way that Google works around this with Borg is that developers get a private namespace for their private stuff, and then anything that's running in a shared namespace is assumed to be shared across a group. So
Joe, we need to write that down somewhere, what you just said. Can you write it in text and email it to me?
Okay, what did I just say?
Yeah,
it's recorded.
Aren't we recording this?
Yes, we are recording it. But Just yeah, okay.
Like in turn, we need to capture these kinds of design principles. So I have a document with a backlog of stuff to document. If you write that down and email it to me, I will add
I don't know, dude. Words come out of my mouth. I don't remember them.
There, I just made a note in the document, the time frame, and when you said it. So.
Okay, thanks. Now that Brendan is here, I want to go back to the new repo discussion. So Brendan, are you going to talk about the new repo stuff at the community meeting?
I was planning on being there, yeah.
Okay, so one thing we discussed earlier is we were looking for a carrot for SIGs to help us finish fleshing out what code they own in terms of subprojects and owners files and things like that. So one idea I had was we could gate giving that SIG new repos on them completing this exercise of identifying what the SIG owns.
That sounds good. So we would gate giving them a SIG org basically on that.
Or SIG, aren't we doing SIG repos at the moment in Kubernetes 6?
Oh, sure, sure. Sorry, SIG repo. Well, so there was a question of whether. Okay, so yeah, we won't give out any.
Either way, ultimately what they want is repos, and we say, well, first you have to identify all your current code before you can create a new repo where new code will live. Yeah,
no, that's fine with me. And as you said, I was actually there for most of that discussion. It doesn't feel that onerous. So, yeah, I didn't really have anything to add, so I didn't talk, but I was listening.
Yeah, I didn't have my Zoom on the tiled view, so I didn't know who was on.
And then there was Sebastian asking about stuff, which brought home the point that like we aren't being very explicit that this is replacing the incubation process with something that is with these 3 stages. So I think just being uber explicit about that would be helpful as you talk about it too.
Yeah, I'll do that. There was an issue. There's someone commented on the PR about that, and I replied. There is something in the fact that says, "I want a new repo. What do I do?"
Yeah, so that's where it showed up.
But it doesn't explicitly say like there is no more incubator. So I should maybe put that up top.
Yeah. So I have a few requests already for some transfers of existing code. In general, I think there are a bunch of issues to work out, but my read of the CLA is if the code is from a single author who has signed the CLA, then it's effectively like a PR, right? Like they can submit the code. So we may want to, we don't have to add that to the initial version, but there is demand for that already amongst the SIGs for people who started some new experimental projects or whatever and want to get other people in the SIG involved. At the moment, in order to keep it simple, they're not taking on more contributors to the existing code base so that it can be more easily transferred in. So I think that's a good case that is covered by our existing CLA and whatnot, that we should extend the rules to support sooner rather than later.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm actually going to have to drop off, but I will. I'll be in there in an hour. Quentin, I'd love to take a look at the doc that you're working on when you get a chance. Send it my way.
The link is in the notes.
Okay, cool. And I do think we should separate the notion of ownership from like multi-group for RBAC kind of stuff. So just for what it's worth.
Cool.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Thanks.
So Brian, I mean, just separately, I think understanding the different ways of importing code under the CLA, especially around the associated project stuff, because we're looking at Heptio. Do we want to take some of the stuff that we've been doing and make it associated projects? What does it mean? Because those things do have multiple authors, some of them outside of Heptio. What are the forms we have to do in terms of chasing people down and getting them to agree?
Yeah, we can get some input from CNCF on that. So a couple of things. One is, this is the kind of thing we can file a service desk ticket for. So we should try that. And the second thing is they are reevaluating the whole inception level project idea.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. So that may be an avenue for some of these associated projects as well, is to go into the CNCF sandbox. Matt?
So I guess my question is, why would a project that already has contributors and people involved outside of the Kubernetes org now want to come and become part of the Kubernetes org? What's the motivation for that?
it happens a lot. So there must be some motivations. I think they're looking for tying into the Kubernetes community. I guess we're trying to make it better known that we can give people things like Slack channels. But I think people perceive that they will get more collaborators if they do that. And I think even Matt Butcher said for Helm that he's pretty sure that moving to the Kubernetes org and the Kubernetes, being under the Kubernetes project umbrella did help with that. Like there are some process negatives, and this is kind of a perceived positive. So I asked Matt if he thought it was net positive, and he felt it was.
Yeah, because you give up a certain amount of control. You've got other things that come along with it. You've got process changes that happen when you move in. And so that becomes, there's positives to it and negatives to it. And I'm wondering if there's some underlying problem we could solve in a different way than bringing more stuff that the steering committee and whoever else needs to deal with.
So I think, if you take the intent, if you read Brendan's document, that there's really 3 different levels that we're talking about here in terms of projects. There's stuff that's in the Kubernetes org that is sort of, for lack of a better word, core nucleus or whatever, right? It's the most sort of Kubernetes-ish stuff. Moving out from that is stuff that's sponsored by SIGs, where it's stuff that doesn't have full endorsement or participation, but is a place for SIGs to actually start working on some code in a collaborative way. And then, there are still some open questions in terms of how do those projects grow up? Do they then migrate in? What's the process for that? Do they stay in that org? Can they call themselves GA or not, based on what does that mean? But in any case, that's the idea. And then there was the third thing, which is associated projects, where they could live anywhere. The amount of process overhead and whatever that goes along with that is near zero. It's things like code of conduct, I think, and is probably going to be the one thing that would come along with that. And the biggest gain out of that, at least from my point of view, is actually being able to take advantage of the CLA from the CNCF, so that you can smooth any future migration path and not have to go through and do a very painful chase down of everything that's going on. So yeah.
Yeah, so I actually see a couple of things that you pointed out there. One is the CLA. And for a lot of us, because we work for companies that have signed it, it's not a problem. But to bring in new contributors to sign a CLA, that does raise a barrier to entry to a lot of people at a lot of companies, because a lot of people work for companies that haven't signed the CNCF CLA, and to get the lawyers at their company to do so, or they're associated, that's an extra hoop, and that stops things. But you also,
what I would say is that if you're running an open source project and you don't have some level of marking contributions as being sort of actually hey, they're allowed to do that, whether it be the DCO or some sort of CLA, you're really
yeah, most companies will have some kind of process around that, regardless of whether we have a CLA or not. And the
CNCF CLA is worlds better than a private company CLA, because part of the CLA is a responsibility on the CNCF to actually use it in standing with sort of the goals of the CNCF versus for a private company.
I got that.
I really like it, because if you're working on all these different projects around the periphery as the ecosystem grows, you don't want to have 12 different CLAs that you have to sign, or other DCO checks, or all the other stuff going on. You sign one, and you can hit all the projects associated with the main org or the main body. That is a highly beneficial thing, I see. We also talked about it, we never kind of explicitly wrote it down, was the idea of, by registering yourself with the bot, you might be able to gain broader visibility, right? The bot registration provides enough metadata for us to basically say, here's the listing of associated projects with CNCF.
Sure, but at the same time, if you look at something like OpenStack, because the CLA caused enough heartburn for people, they looked at going with the DCO, because that was a lot easier for people and companies to engage in. And if you look at the other CNCF projects, I think, is it Kubernetes and gRPC are the only ones using a CLA? And so there's a whole lot of DCO usage out there because it smooths that out. And now we're saying a lot of projects should go into the CLA. And Joe actually hit on a point of, because maybe someday it'll move into core Kubernetes. And so you can already see a thought out there of, is that the reason too? people think, oh, maybe someday I'll get into core, so let's get the CLA going early because that'll smooth that process eventually. Because if we want a small moving core where we don't have a lot to manage, which I keep hearing people say, then we don't really want to bring in a lot more projects. We want to have a healthy ecosystem outside of it. Like everything I install from apt, from Debian, it's not run by Debian. That's much smaller, right? Those are all individual projects that are separately managed. They don't all have to be brought into Debian to be part of it. And so the same kind of thing can apply to Kubernetes. If we want to keep the core small and what the project has to manage small and enable people outside, do we want to look at something that doesn't tightly couple them to have some kind of association, to maybe say, you know what, you don't have to have the CLA bot checking to see all of the other associated things, right? Is there other ways we could do that? Yeah, they did. They actually had a lot of problems, and I know there was a lot of heartburn about, because moving from a CLA to a DCO was hard. I don't remember the final reason on why they didn't, because I had moved on to other things by the time that happened. But they looked into it because there was a lot of desire to do so, but legally it was very hard to switch.
So Matt, I think, so first of all, like my comment around keeping flexibility open was not necessarily moving to core Kubernetes. You have no idea sort of other ways we're going to find a group and promote and sort of, layer these things in the future, right? So I think it's just a matter of flexibility. And the second thing is that I'm not quite sure what you're asking for here, because like projects don't have to opt into this world. I mean, they can, they can continue to do whatever they want outside of Kubernetes. There's no must here. I think, and the name, associated project is not perfect. I think the idea was to have a class of projects where the endorsement level was near zero, right? This is not endorsement by Kubernetes. This is just somebody who wanted to say, I'm in the Kubernetes orbit and I want to just make sure that I, streamline folks who are already contributing to Kubernetes. So I'm not quite sure what exactly it is that you're asking for.
Well, I would actually say the endorsement isn't zero because we're saying it's an associated project. And we may all say the endorsement is zero, but anybody who goes and sees a list of this is not going to think the endorsement is zero because it's listed as an associated project. And so people will see some form of endorsement to these projects. Maybe somebody opted in and somebody else didn't opt into this. They're going to say, oh, this is an associated one and its competitor isn't associated. So this is kind of the declared one. We're totally going to get into that kind of situation.
We haven't even mentioned even listing. It was a topic of conversation, but we haven't actually refined a list or said there was going to be a published list anywhere.
Well,
it was
the project.
Yeah, it was a topic for us to basically do an audit, right? It was not necessarily.
And any list that we come up with doesn't necessarily have to, like we could have like a list of ecosystem projects and the associated projects get listed there along with other stuff, right?
But then what's the difference between an associated project and an ecosystem project when one has decided to, like, it in people's minds who are going to be the consumers of this, because a majority of the consumers of everything have nothing to do with contribution. How will they perceive the difference in this and what does it mean? And then how will people try to use that to game the system? And what extra workload does that put on the Kubernetes org? That's the reason I'm asking these questions, because where we say it means no, it doesn't mean anything extra. To a lot of people who are just consumers of it, who follow from the edge, it probably will.
I'm not sure this is architecture topic. I think this is something else. Can we perhaps
table it? Yeah, it's going to be discussed at the community meeting. That's probably the right place to discuss it.
That's what I was going to say, and we shouldn't try and future-proof ramifications from things that haven't happened yet either. There's just too many variables. So also being mindful that community is on top of trying to watch for these sort of social norms that form around the project. So there's levels of reassurance that we can invoke if needed. All right, okay. So we have 15 minutes left.
So I actually want to call the meeting. I have some stuff I need to do before the community meeting. And we exhausted everything on the agenda, and we've been mostly talking about not SIG architecture stuff. So I am going to take off. You can continue to chat if you want, but I have to go.
Okay, so, thanks, Brian.
Thanks a lot. If you do have something that you want to try to talk about, please try to get it on the next week's agenda as soon as possible. 2 weeks from now is the Helm Summit that I'm going to be there, so I'm probably not going to be here. Yeah, Tim.
I just had a quick question. Do we have a process or anything for migrating stuff out of Kubernetes org into the SIG org yet?
No.
Okay.
So far, we have said we are not moving anything out of the Kubernetes org.
Well, I think there are people
wants to.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like I think we have people on SIG scheduling who would be okay with making some of those moves. And I want to make sure that we find a happy path for them. So.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in terms of happy path, since we're talking about imposing more consistency on the things in the Kubernetes repo, like you must buy into all of our automation, as long as the SIG says, yeah, we want this repo, I think there are not going to be any barriers to that move. That's the intent anyway, and we can say that at the meeting. But like, if Helm wants to move to a SIG repo, or some scheduling project wants to move to a SIG repo or whatever, yeah, I'm totally cool with that.
We should clarify the impact for anyone that wants to do that. We should clarify the impacts that it will have on them in terms of all their links breaking, all their jobs breaking, and I'm happy to.
Links won't break.
Well, things break.
That actually works really well.
The forwarding and yeah, there are, but yeah, we certainly, when we did this with COPS, like I guess 2 years ago or whatever it was surprisingly disruptive. But
Go imports break.
There's that.
Actually, that's a good point. So we have Kates.io in terms of the Go import stuff. There's a question of Go imports on the SIG thing, but that's a different topic.
All right, anybody object to adjourning early and getting a few minutes back? All right, everybody, thanks. Look for recording later. Have a great day, and I'll see you later at the meeting.
Okay, thanks.